my time-travelling Tudor friends, and I'm delighted to be able to introduce our next guest, who is going to be talking about a topic which is particularly dear to my heart, and that is lost buildings, and in particular the research that this guest undertook to identify the exact position of the long-lost temporary palace, which features so prominently in the well-known painting of the Field of Cloth of Gold, which, as many of you will know, today hangs at Hampton Court. So our guest today is Julian Munby, and he is a graduate of the Institute of Archaeology in London and has over 45 years experience of historic buildings and landscapes, and today works as Head of Buildings Archaeology at Oxford Archaeology in Oxford. Now, Julian has undertaken studies of medieval timber frame buildings. He's worked on medieval houses, castles, cathedrals and country houses. And he's interested both in the archaeology of the buildings and the link between the documentary history and the extant remains of the past. It's fair to say that Julian has an extensive range of not only experience but of publications on historical and archaeological topics, and he has appeared on Time Team programmes. He was himself instrumental in the rediscovery of Edward III's round table building at Windsor Castle, and as I mentioned at the top of this introduction, he was also the person who was responsible for locating the site of Henry VIII's temporary palace at the Field of Cloth of Gold. Now, I met with Julian face to face to interview him and to find out more about this scintillating topic. So let's go over and hear just what Julian has to tell us about the lost palace at the Field of Cloth of Gold. So welcome, Julian, to Field of Cloth of Gold 500. It's going to be exciting today to talk a little bit about a different aspect of the field, which I particularly find really interesting, and that's the whole kind of the geography and the topography, but also particularly you read a really interesting paper about some research you did where you went about trying to locate some of the important landmarks associated with the field, and in particular Henry VIII's temporary palace. So that's what we're going to be diving into today. But I wondered, first of all, why did you go about doing that research? What drove you to dive into that?
Well, I'm always curious about where things are. And when people talk about something like the Field of Cloth of Gold, you think, well, field, what field? Where is this field? Where is it?
Yeah.
And I know that you drove past it and you could see road signs sort of saying, this is the field. And I think, well, whose field? Why? Where? And then thinking about the castle and the famous painting at Hampton Court, I think, well, precisely where, it would be great to find out exactly where it was. And when I discovered that the castle, which is a central part of that picture, no longer exists, that really got me going to find out where that castle was and how that relates to the lost palace.
There's something fascinating about lost places, isn't there? And finding them again. Yes.
And the extraordinary thing about this one is it's been painted, it's been planned, it's been mapped. There are about 6 English plans of it in the British Library. Tudor maps of this castle and the landscape. So there's actually, 6 or 7 contemporary maps and images showing all this stuff, which isn't immediately apparent today because landscape has got enclosed, things have changed. So I set out wanting to find out what was where.
Good. So there was a real itch to be scratched, which I appreciate.
But it involved going there. So you've got all these maps, you've got the history stuff, you've actually got to go there and look for it.
A real adventure. Now, obviously the event took place on the Pale of Calais, and that's obviously a kind of a phrase, a terminology that's bandied around a lot, but there may be people who really don't know exactly what the Pale is. So maybe you could describe what a pale is and what the Pale of Calais was?
Well, a pale is like a park pale. It's a bank with a series of wooden stakes on it with a ditch in front of it. And in a park, it's to stop the deer getting out. And here it's to stop the French getting in. And it was enormous. It went from Calais, which was over there, miles across to here, right down to the marshes, up onto the downs and round again. It's about 80 square miles. So that's 80 square miles of English territory in France, on the edge of the empire. It had the empire on the up on the north, and France on the other side. And we'd had it since the 14th century, famously lost it in Queen Mary's reign. But it's the one bit of English land that we still had in France. So when there's a political event of meeting the French king, it was the obvious place to do it.
So it was a politically, strategically, a very important place. And was it defended in any way? Was there a pale? Do we know?
Well, that is the most mysterious thing. There are castles galore. There were strings of castles along the fort, the great fort of Calais itself. There were bulwarks and castles all around these rivers. But there's very little evidence that there was a pale. We've got contemporary descriptions of lots of bits of land. They never actually mention the pale. So possibly it was just roads with turnpikes on, and it was defended effectively by those castles and by water, because there was a lot of floodable land. Though famously the French came in winter when everything was frozen.
Okay, so they could easily get across.
They could easily get across that.
So if we zoom in to the actual geography
Yeah.
of the event itself and maybe have a look at the map, Guisnes and Ardres were the two main towns. So can you explain why they were selected and used, and maybe some of the geography of the immediate area and where the event actually took place?
I think Guisnes is there because it's like the frontier town. So Calais is the big port on the coast. That's where we've got our wool staple, masses of trade, shipping going on there. But the actual frontier fort was Guisnes Castle down here, with the Castle of Ham just behind it in the marshes. And just across the way was the French town of Ardres. So if you're going to meet nearby, Guisnes and Ardres would be very suitable places within, minutes, half an hour's ride from one to the other. The other thing is that just like you have battles, something like Chalgrove Field takes place in the open fields of Chalgrove, which don't have hedges, they're just open fields, and after harvest it's all open land. So the field is actually this big space here in the fields of Guisnes and the villages next to it, Ballingham and Indre, and they are just like any of our villages at the bottom of the downs, because we've got chalk downs here. The chalk downs from Kent cross the channel, pop up on this side, so you've got downland with woods on top, dip slope on the other side, and this is the scarp slope, and all the villages are sitting at the bottom of that slope. So it's absolutely champion cornland. So that is the place where you could have events. So you've got the downs at the top, and then they come down to these marshes at the bottom, this great string of marshes. And somewhere between there and there, on a stretch that's about 2 miles long, the events of the field took place.
Wow.
And when you look at the painting, there are jousting fields, there are tents, there are feasting areas, there's a whole lot of gear that's there, and then all the people and all their horses and everything. So it's like some huge fairground. They easily could have filled that space.
Do you think they would have made the use of most of that 2 miles, or do you think it was much concentrated in a much smaller space?
Well, I mean, it's said to be sort of in a smaller space, about a mile. And then there's these... It's quite flat, that land, so we've got slight dips, but there are very flat bits over here. So maybe that first mile had most of it. But again, is it too close to the English side? Is it too close to the French side? You probably have to even it out.
Yes.
And nothing has yet been found there, though the painting does show some huge brick ovens. And one day I think someone is going to find where
excavate the
find where
ovens.
those brick ovens were. But otherwise it's very ephemeral. It's tents, it's jousting grounds, it's pegs in the ground, stakes in the ground.
Yes.
It wouldn't leave a lot of evidence.
So you talked about Calais, and obviously Calais is where Henry arrived when he came over from England. And how far between Calais and Guisnes, and how did Henry get to Guisnes? What evidence do we have, if any?
It's only about 5 miles away, 5, 6 miles away, and later on, right into the 19th century, the obvious way to go is by water. Yeah, they had water buses, they had regular boats going up and down the river. But of course, just off those marshes, you're back onto the chalkland, and there's roads going through villages. So I think probably he rode on horseback through those villages on the road. And the painting shows a procession arriving in Guînes. So I think they've come by road.
Yes.
But supplies and other things would have come and gone up and down the river. In fact, most of this landscape is a wet landscape.
That's one of the things that really surprised me when I was reading your
Yeah.
paper, and now sitting here with the map in front of me. There's an awful lot of water, isn't
Yeah.
there? So it does really narrow down where people could travel.
Yeah, I mean, this is a bit like bits of Lincolnshire that in the 12th and 13th century got enclosed. And you have those huge fenland landscapes with loads of canals, lots of rivers, lots of drains, and some roads going through them.
Yeah.
And that's very like this bit here.
Right.
When you get near to Guînes, it's much more like the Norfolk Broads.
All right.
Because all these Tudor maps have these very puzzling series of plashes. So you have the Guînes plash and the Ard plash. And I was trying to work out what these were. And I suddenly realised that just like the Norfolk Broads, they were peat diggings. Because this is all, just like the fens, this is a silt fen, but this band along here is a peat fen. So all of that, because of the sea coming and going and the Ice Age and later, there's a lot of rich peatland there. So all these towns and villages are digging the peat for their fuel, leaving behind ponds, which in the Tudor times were enormous, and then gradually are filled in. So even on the landscape today, there are little areas with ponds, but most of those big plashes have filled in.
Brilliant.
So those plashes then became rivers, so you could sort of sail between them. And there's other ditches and places. And there's this one really interesting area north of Guînes, which was enclosed. And there's another Tudor map, shows a complete enclosed landscape with lots of canals and ditches and little houses on each one. And it was always thought that was just a plan that never happened. And then I realised, looking at the map and looking at the aerial photographs, that it's all there. Not the houses, but the actual divisions of the land took place almost exactly as shown on this map. And one of my favourite bits of evidence is a Welsh chronicler who was stuck in Calais and wrote a Welsh chronicle. And in Aberystwyth, they've got this enormous volume written by him in the 15th century. And somewhere in the middle of that, he talks about the digging of 30-foot ditch. He's there when they're digging this 30-foot ditch and all these diggings going on.
What a wonderful piece of evidence.
Yes. And there's so much engineering involved, you see. All these fortifications, all this stuff involves a huge amount of...
Well, speaking of fortifications, obviously there was a huge castle at Guînes.
Yes.
That the royal party stayed in. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about the town and the castle in particular. What would we have seen if we'd have been there in 1520?
I mean, the disappointing thing now is when you go there, it's a lovely historic town, it's got its motte, and you look around for the rest of the castle, you can't see it. And the church is there, and the marketplace is there.
So the motte, by definition, just for clarity, is...
That's a big earthen mound, and that was part of the original Motte and Bailey castle. So there would have been an earth motte with a tower on it and a wooden earthen bailey round it with wooden fortifications, just like the Normans brought over here. That was gradually replaced by stonework, and with the English being there from the 100 Years' War, from the mid-14th century, it had become a very strongly fortified castle. So it had a huge inner bailey, a great gatehouse, it had other bulwarks built around the edge of it. And one of the most exciting things in the early evidence is a whole series of plans for building more bulwarks and more bulwarks. And you think, actually, did they build them or not?
Yeah.
And some of them, they probably didn't build them. But those plans enable us, by comparing them with the 19th century plans of the town, to work out where the castle was.
And it might also be useful to just define what a bulwark is for those people who may be unsure.
It is, in Tudor terms, it is an earthen outwork on which you can put cannons.
So...
And then later on you get bastions, which are proper sort of diamond-shaped things you have lots of cannons on. So they're outworks outside the castle, and it basically means you have lots of cannons firing outwards and firing across each other. So you've got flanking fire, so if anyone attacks you can shoot them from all directions. And military engineers are always having great designs and plans for these. And in fact, Francois built a fantastic one at Ard. There's an enormous French bastion at Ard. There's not much left.
That's still there, isn't it?
That is still there. But annoyingly, whereas on all the maps of Guînes, you can see the fortifications, on the 19th century map of Ard, there's a huge blank. So they don't plot them, and it's very difficult to find out where they were.
Do we have any sense, just for a matter of scale, I'm curious, do we know how big the castle at Guînes was in relation to any maybe existing castle that we still have here in the UK that people might be able to compare it to?
Well, it's at least as big as the Tower of London, if
Right.
not bigger. It's a proper big-sized castle with curtain walls, towers, huge gatehouse, and then other areas outside that were brought in.
That's a really good, pretty much everybody knows the Tower of London, so it's a great comparison.
Yeah.
And then there was the temporary palace,
Yes.
which is so fated and famous. Can you talk a little bit about, first of all, what that looked like?
Well, this is the other thing that was so intriguing, that everyone knows this lovely painting at Hampton Court, which shows Henry in a procession approaching that palace and approaching the castle. And the picture is so amazing. It's got dragons flying overhead, it's got tournaments happening. It's obviously anachronistic because Henry is arriving and things are already happening. All the marshes are flooded, so it looks like it's on the edge of the sea. And you assume this is a fantasy picture.
I certainly assumed, I certainly assumed quite a bit of it was fantasy.
Then you read the contemporary descriptions of this castle and you realise it's about 300 foot square, which means it's as big as one of the courtyards at Hampton Court, or as big as Wolsey's Christchurch in Oxford, Tom Quad. And then you realise actually it's timber framed and covered in canvas. So it's actually like a huge timber framed tent, and yet it's a 2-storey palace. And upstairs it's got chambers, withdrawing chambers, bed chambers, privy chambers, for the king on one side and the queen on the other. It's a proper big palace.
It's amazing.
It may have had on it those terracotta roundels that are now at Hampton Court. That's one possibility. It certainly had decorations on it. And so it's the timbers are brought over, it's all erected, built there, and on the 10th of June, Francois comes there for dinner with his court. So it's a proper active palace. And then, of course, it's gone. And no one really knew where it was. And that was the other thing I was really trying to find out. Where was this thing?
Yes. Yeah. So, I mean, that's so curious. How did you go about trying to work that out?
It's a case of going backwards and going forwards. So going backwards, you've got you look at the modern map, there's no castle. There's a motte and no castle. If you go we went to the record office in Arras, and they have the 19th century map, which is called the cadastre, the Napoleonic cadastre, which is a bit like our tithe maps. It's a complete land map of all the communes. And that shows all the properties in Guînes. It shows the motte. You can see where the rough outline of where the castle must have been. But most importantly, it's got all the little streams and ditches around the town. So it has got this, as it were, the outer moat of the castle was still there in the 1830s. So that takes you back to 1830.
Yeah.
You've then got the Tudor maps coming forwards, and then there's some other early French views. There's a lovely 18th century view of the town that shows where the town walls were. So we gradually managed to piece together a picture, which gave us this rather puzzling result, that we have a walled town over here, and we've got a castle over there, and there's no joining between them. You cannot get from the town to the castle.
Curiouser and curiouser.
And that is why the painting is so odd, because the painting shows Henry having come down the road from Calais, and that means he'd have to come into the town through the west gate, he'd have to come through the marketplace, but he'd then have to leave the town. And some of the earlier maps show this little wooden gate, exactly as shown on the painting. So Henry comes out of a little wooden gate. He then has to go around the outside of the moat, past all the bulwarks, in order to come back into the castle, into that great gate. So what we're seeing, all this bizarre picture is showing Henry coming into the town, or his procession, coming all the way out, then coming all the way in and into the castle.
So exactly as he did. The painting is actually an accurate depiction of Henry's arrival.
And as he turns left to go into the castle, this temporary palace is on his right. So in terms of the picture, it has to be right there.
Wow, that's amazing.
Now, they don't agree with me in Geen. In Geen, they think it was across the road over there, but that doesn't match with the picture. And so much on this picture, I mean, you know, the depiction of the wooden gate, the shape of the marketplace, the shape of the castle, so much of it is accurately depicted that the artist must have been there.
And that therefore your assumption is therefore the position of the temporary castle must also be accurate.
Yes.
Yeah.
That he either saw it or someone told him exactly where it was. Now that did have some brick foundations, apparently, and some wine cellars.
Yes, so you should be able to excavate.
It should, the theory is, it should be possible if one went there.
Has anybody tried to excavate?
Well, no, because no one before is. Well, the French thing is on one side of the road. I think it's on the other side of the road, and no one's yet been there to dig it up. But I think what it has shown is that all this amazing amount of evidence does at least present a consistent story.
Yes.
And all we don't know precisely where that palace was. We roughly know where it was, and we still like to know quite how far down the field they were. And I would love to know more about the castle in Ardres, because it's the French castle that really has totally disappeared.
How interesting. There is a feature, though, of the temporary palace that is specifically mentioned in the accounts, and that's this secret passageway that connected the. I think the actual words are secret passageway. If I remember
well, it's a gallery. They also, well, I mean,
can you describe that then? What did it actually look like?
Right.
Because I've been trying to work that out in my mind.
Medieval palaces tended not to be a big building. They tend to be separate buildings. So there'll be a hall, there'll be a chapel, there'll be chambers, perhaps a Queen's chamber, a King's chamber, Knight's chamber. And very often these are joined together with pentices or corridors. There's one at Canterbury Cathedral. There's a timber-framed corridor at Canterbury Cathedral in the Priory. So it's quite regular for buildings to be joined with weatherproof passages. So this gallery need be no more than a walkway from one to the other.
That was covered.
Except it did have to cross two moats.
Yes.
So it probably, and if it was for the royal party, it's probably at first floor level. So it's probably a sort of flying bridge.
That's extraordinary. I still, even though I know the amount of men and money and materials that were put behind this, I still find it utterly extraordinary to conceive that it was built so quickly.
Well, again, you see, we're talking about the army, we're talking about all these engineers. They're spending all their time building fortifications. They'd be used to bringing in over shiploads of gear and rapidly putting up a bridge or putting up a siege engine or something. So it's not just sort of, you know, rustic carpenters building a barn. They're probably used to the stuff. They could even have, you know, they could have reused, they might have taken down some buildings and reused them. But I don't think that bridge would be a great difficulty. It is the one thing for which I think there's a measurement for it, which is slightly tricky, but wherever it was around the castle, it must have crossed the moats at high level.
And do we know anything of the actual royal apartments in the castle itself? Do we know anything of the lodgings?
Not really, except that I think they were hung with arrases and things like that, because we know that sort of gear was taken over. But what you do have to remember is the entire royal household was used to being on the move. Now, it's not as bad as in King John's day, where you never stayed anywhere for longer than 3 nights. But the royal household was used to being on the move, which meant there was a travelling kitchen, there was a travelling chapel, there was a travelling library. You had all the horse gear and all the saddles and all that stuff. You had all the beds, you had all the curtains, you had all the cushions. So there were people who were used to loading up and unloading wagons so they could fill out an apartment. So I think it just would have been a bigger version of that. And they'd have had their wall hangings ready, they'd have had their, well, either carpets or stuff to put on the floor. It wouldn't have been very different from sort of moving from Hampton Court to Greenwich or moving up to Woodstock or, you know, moving around like they normally did, which involved huge wagon trains.
Yes, yeah.
I don't know what the Queen does today. Is it sort of 2 Pantechnicons take her up to Sandringham or somewhere?
Yeah,
it still happens, but it's different.
Yes.
You get wardrobes you put onto a lorry and drive it around. Well, they had lots and lots and lots of horse-drawn wagons carrying all the stuff around.
So, your research, obviously you're convinced as to where the temporary palace was. Is there anything else actually? We've talked a lot about the picture of the Field of Cloth of Gold picture. Are there any other features on that, sort of geographically, that are interesting?
Well, the most interesting thing about the picture, and you really have to be standing in front of it to see it, is nowadays we think, the rules of landscape painting are you sort of paint what you see. Normally you paint what you see. If it's in the 19th or 18th century, Turner or someone, it's all made a bit more romantic. The mountains get taller, the rivers get deeper, the waterfalls splash a bit more. At that time, there weren't really quite the same developed rules of landscape, and it's almost like a picture map. Because the picture is, on the one hand, looking from Guisnes back towards Calais, which is back towards the north.
So that's the picture on the left-hand side.
That's right.
As you stand
so
looking at it.
It's a long painting, and on the left-hand side, it's looking across the water. You think, that's the sea, but it's not. That's the flooded marshes to Calais on the skyline.
And you can actually faintly see, you pointed out, you can actually faintly see Calais on the skyline.
Just
there.
as you will today. If you stand on the top of the downs there, you see just the same, you see the towers of Calais. And then in the foreground, there looks like an island. Well, that's the castle of Ham, which is halfway between Guisnes and Thingy. You're then looking at the town, with Henry, as I've just described, coming into the town, out of the town, into the castle. And then the rest of the picture, you've got to turn at least 90 degrees to look southeast across the field. And there you're looking at the tents, at the tilt yards, the stands, the tree of honour that had all the shields on it, and the French town beyond. So it's almost a bit like a panorama.
It is, isn't it?
The picture is actually doing that.
Yes.
And at the same time, there's a procession coming in.
It's very clever.
So it's not, you look at it, it's nonsense. But it's well thought out.
Very good.
And there's very few details that are sort of obviously wrong.
So when anybody next goes and stands in front of that picture, they can feel quite confident that what they're looking at is actually a realistic representation of what was going on.
And I may yet be proved wrong on the position of the palace, but until I'm proved wrong.
Do you have any future plans to take this further, or
no,
do you know of any afoot anywhere?
I mean, the trouble is, it's in about sort of 8 different back gardens, so it'd be quite an event. Trying to plan that and deciding where to go and getting permission
So let's just talk a moment about Ardres, because you mentioned that you were interested in the castle there.
Yeah.
So maybe you could tell us a little bit about, because obviously Ardres was the place that Francis I shacked up with his court. So what was the castle like there? Do we know anything about it?
Well, the funny thing is, there is a tiny Motte and Bailey castle. Again, there's an earth castle on one side of it, but there was a big chateau, which has gone. In addition to that, there was this circuit of town walls. Right. So we know quite a lot about those from later plans. Though the 19th century plan just leaves it blank, so we don't know where they are. And then there's this one huge brick bulwark or bastion that Francois built. Curiously facing east rather than towards the English, but it may have been he may have intended several of them, and that's an enormous, again fortified with gun ports and place for cannon. And the town's on a bit of a hill, so you've got the church and the marketplace. It's a bit like Guisnes, but it's more up on a hill. But of the castle, there is absolutely no trace. But it is a richly documented landscape. There's a great 16th century survey of it in the Public Record Office, which has hardly yet been studied. Lots of descriptions of all the English land. And that's interesting, it's written like a map. It doesn't have maps in it, but a lot of the roads and canals that it describes, it gives you the bearings. So it sort of says northeast and 2 points to the west. And
very precise.
Yes.
So I'm just wondering, if people were to go to this region today, wanting to go in the footsteps of Henry VIII and the Field of Cloth of Gold, what could they see? What could they look for? Anything at all?
Yes, indeed. Now, you make sure you don't get on the road or shoot past, or the road or the railway, or shoot past it in about 5 minutes and not notice. But if you go sort of round the back, behind the railway, through those little villages, down towards Guisnes, The landscape of the town is still there. You can walk up the river. You've got a nice little museum in the town. There's the remains of the castle you can see. You can walk around the town with its church. And then you can travel out on the old road out across where the field was. You can go up the hill into the woods. And there's the other famous place in the wood where the first cross-channel balloon landing took place. And the two balloonists landed in the wood up there.
Very different event.
Indeed, you can go to that spot. So there's a lovely, little villages, there's a landscape, and Ardres is a lovely town. And it is close to Calais, so if for any reason you've popped over to Calais for the day,
yes.
and you have a car, you can easily go down and
It really is very close, isn't it? Good, well, I think that probably concludes our chat today. So thank you very much, Julian, for sharing all your research and knowledge about the field, and particularly Henry VIII's temporary palace.
Thank you very much. It's been very good talking to you.
Thanks.